Hi, and today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Kantian ethics. Kantian's ethics is called Kantian ethics because it's discovered or developed by Immanuel Kant in the 18th century. But by far, we're not going to be interested, by far, we are not going to be interested in just a historical analysis of what Kant thought. We're more interested in whether he has the correct theory, whether it can be improved upon or corrected. So just because this theory, as opposed to virtue ethics and utilitarianism, still bears the name of its founder, don't think that it anymore that it should be too connected or dependent on Kant. Rather, it should be credited to him as the initial discoverer. But of course, there are modern day Kantians who have radically and greatly modified and improved upon the theory that he first put forth. Okay. Sometimes, to avoid the association with Kant, it's called deontology, but I'm going to stick to calling it Kantian ethics. So how does Kantian ethics differ from the other major moral theories, virtue ethics and utilitarianism? Well, let me tell you first about how it differs from virtue ethics. For one, it's going to provide us with a clear rule for developing what's right and what's wrong. If you might remember that virtue ethics is focused on character, on developing these character traits through experience, and then being able to identify by properly weighing the considerations in a circumstance to come to the right judgment about what to do or what to say or what to believe. And so for a virtue ethicist, there aren't going to be rules, right? It's much more like the analogy I like is playing a musical instrument. There's no rules that will make you an expert flute player or violin player, but through practice and habituation, you'll eventually not only come to be able to be an expert player, but you'll also be able to write your own music, identify good music and bad music. And so the virtue ethicist thinks that morality is like that. It's like, learning the instrument of life to live a good human life, learning how to play the human instrument. Okay. Enough with the analogy. The other theory, so there's the difference with virtue ethics, right? Kant is going to be like the utilitarian in that he's going to give us a clear-cut rule, unlike virtue ethicists. Unlike the utilitarian, now remember the utilitarian, while they're going to give us a clear-cut rule, they're going to say the rule depends on looking at the consequences of an action. So a utilitarian will be a consequentialist because he's going to be looking to see, does this action bring about good consequences or bad consequences? And the utilitarian is going to say, well, what's good and what's bad is pleasure and suffering. So we're going to look to see if an action brings about, maximizes pleasure over suffering, or does the action increase the amount of suffering or not increase the amount of pleasure as much as it could. So the utilitarian is going to look to an action and say, I don't care if it's a lie or an instance of stealing or murder or torture. What matters is what the end is, what it brings about. And if it brings about a lot of happiness, it improves the amount of overall pleasure in the world, not just my pleasure, but total pleasure in the world, total good in the world, then it's the right action. And so the utilitarian is much more clear-cut than the virtue ethicists, right? They're going to be able to, maybe an advantage of their theory, they're going to say is like they're able to give us answers, whereas virtue ethicists have this sort of wishy-washy appeal to experience. Now the virtue ethicist is going to say that that's just how it is. There is nothing else we can do but appeal to experiences, and that this sort of rule the utilitarian's giving us is not going to work out. But the utilitarian's going to rebut and say, well, at least we're giving an answer. The virtue ethicists are not really answering the question about what we should do. They're just sort of saying that we'll know if we know. So the Kantian is going to agree with the utilitarian that we need a clear-cut rule, but they're going to disagree with the utilitarian about what the rule is and how the rule should depend on consequences. In particular, utilitarianism is going to say consequences are irrelevant, right? We shouldn't look at the consequences of an action at all. Instead, we should look at what the action is, right? So the Kantian is going to say, I'm more interested in whether it's an instance of torture or rape or an instance of lying or killing, and what is the action? What is it you're proposing to do, regardless what the consequences are, right? And the utilitarian is the exact opposite. The utilitarian is going to only look at the consequences and not care what the action is. So they're starkly different in that respect. So that's why Kantian ethics is often called an instance of deontology. Deontological ethics is usually contrasted with a consequentialist ethics, and that deontology is looking at the nature of the action, while a consequentialist theory looks at the consequences of the action. So what are the ways in which actions does a Kantian want us to do and which actions does a Kantian not want us to do? Well, they're going to provide us with a rule for sorting these out. And the rule that Kant's going to look for, he calls the categorical imperative. So Kant thinks that there are these two types of imperatives. So an imperative just means like a command, a moral command, right? But we can also, well, so he's looking for the moral command. And first he talks a little bit about hypothetical imperatives. And those are commands that go along the lines of something like, if you want to be a doctor, you should go to med school. If you want to satisfy your hunger, you should go eat. If you're hungry, you should go eat, or something along those lines. So there's an if, and then there's a then clause. It's a hypothetical. Kant thinks that that can't be what morality is like. Morality has to apply to everyone regardless. And on top of that, hypothetical imperatives, you can always get out of them, right? So it says something like, if you want to be a doctor, go to med school. Of course, you could always just give up on your goal of going to med school, and then you don't have to, or being a doctor, and then you don't have to go to med school anymore. So the imperatives, you can get out of the imperatives by dropping or avoiding whatever the if clause, whatever the antecedent of the hypothetical has in it. Also, hypothetical imperatives only apply to a small subset of people, right? If you're hungry, you should eat. Well, what if you're not hungry? Then it's not going to make any sort of command on you. And if morality was like a hypothetical imperative, presumably it'd be something like, if you want to help people, or if you love humanity, or if you want to be moral, then do X or Y. And then Kant thinks that that just leaves too much open to the individual person, right? Kant wants to say, if morality exists, it's got to be a categorical imperative, so one that applies to everyone no matter what. So instead of if X, then do Y, a moral command is going to just say do Y. So it's, you know, while a hypothetical imperative might say something like, if you want to be a doctor, go to med school, Kant's going to say morality would be something like, don't murder, don't lie, don't steal. So there's no sort of hypothetical if part to the command, to the imperative. Okay. So Kant's not assuming that there is a categorical imperative. He's just saying if morality exists at all, it would have to be a categorical imperative. So what is the categorical imperative that Kant thinks exists? Well, it turns out, he says, there is only one categorical imperative, and he's going to tell us what it is, but then he says it three different ways. And each of the three ways seem really different. So most modern-day Kantians disagree with Kant about this. They say Kant really ends up uncovering three categorical imperatives. Three similar categorical imperatives that sometimes come to the same result, usually agree, but it doesn't seem like they're actually the same. So what I'm going to treat them as three just different rules. And a Kantian can be free to adopt only one of them. You could adopt all three and then have some sort of order about which one's primary and which ones are secondary. You could, some Kantians say that one applies all the time while the others only apply sometimes. So you can play with the Kantian ethics and adjust it. You know, try figuring out what the right combination of these rules are, dropping out one, adding to it, adjusting it. But generally Kantians are going to say it's one of these three rules, if not all of them, which is correct. So what are the three rules? Well, the first we call the formula of universal law, the second we call the formula of humanity, and the third we call the formula of the kingdom of ends. And they're called formulas because they're formulations or different ways of saying the categorical imperative, or at least that's what Kant wants to say. But we'll call them the three categorical imperatives. And what I'll do in my next video is talk about what they are.